Good evening. This is Mary Buckham opening the door to the Conflict on the Page class. This is the class where we'll be talking about conflict for the conflict averse writer. So I've opened the door here a few minutes early so we can get everyone into the class. It looks like it's going to be a very full class, which is fun and exciting. And we'll just get started in a minute or so. If you are in the classroom or busy getting comfortable in the classroom, feel free to let me know you're on board. That lets me know that you can hear me talking, and I can wave at you through the computer. I can make faces if I need to. So again, Mary Buckham here, welcoming you to Conflict on the Page for the conflict averse writer. As you get into the classroom, feel free to let me know where you are. If you have any questions you've been thinking about, I sent the homework out here last week, I think. And I hope you've been reading books and watching TV shows, movies, seeing where conflict occurs in everyday life. Because the more you are used to being able to identify conflict, Okay. Good evening. This is Mary back, second time around. Um, Anna, I hope that you can hear me and other people can hear me too. We had a little glitch on this end. We're in a new place. Yay, Aiden can hear me. So we're going to give it just a minute or two because we had to have people sign out and reconnect. So I'll make sure that everybody that was in the classroom gets back into it. So if you can hear me, feel free to let me know that you can hear me, that coming through. I thought being connected out of Washington State was difficult, but it is nothing like trying to get connected in this little corner of Texas. So Mary Buckham here. We're going to be talking about conflict on the page for conflict adverse writers. So as you check in, please let me know that you can hear me. Yay, Bettina! And I'm coming through loud and clear. Thank you. Really appreciate that. All right. Got a few more people to get on board. Again, there are some new people in class here tonight, and glad to have you on board. We're going to dig in here in just a second. Yay! So we've got it. Melissa, Barb's on board. Chris is on here. Anna got the slides and sound. Yay. And Tina from Idaho. Okay, if Idaho's here, the rest of the country should be here too. So we're going to get started here. I apologize for that little glitch there, but it's good to know that we can survive. And Wisconsin's on board, and that's saying a lot, Peggy. All right, so for those who are new to this process, or if you're listening to this on the replay, this is your information. If you lose sound or the slides aren't advancing on the screen, there will be places that I'll be pausing, but if they're not advancing for a long time and you don't hear me in your ear, you can celebrate and then you're going to want to reconnect. So a little button at the top that's going to be able to get you moving forward. If you've tried that button and you still can't hear me or the slides aren't advancing, this is what you need to do. Make sure you don't have other programs on your computer because these webinars can be computer hogs. Log out of your browser, then log back in. And if possible, use the Google Chrome browser. For some reason that gets through, whereas other browsers don't necessarily, they can be more problematic. And third, restart your computer and try re-entering the webinar with the same link that you were sent. So, also, if you are listening to this on the replay, and I know a number of you are simply because it's that time of year and you're crazy busy, in the right-hand corner, if you do nothing, you can hear the webinar from start to end, all 90 minutes, whatever it will last here. But if you want to pause and go back and go forward or take notes, YouTube little button down there, click that. That will get you to the YouTube version of the webinar, and you can jump ahead, jump backwards, whatever you need to do. So, and that's what will happen. You'll see a screen like this. So we're going to be digging in here and talking about conflict. Now, I really appreciate those people who were able to send me questions beforehand and to dig into the homework. And the homework was literally to watch movies, read a book. I know it's a hardship. Watch TV shows and start identifying conflict that you see. Because the more you can see it in real life, the easier it is to discover how powerful it is for a writer to keep our work strong and moving forward. So I'll be covering some of the questions that came through to me at the end of the class, so hang in there, we'll get to them. Now, when we talk about conflict on the page, what we're talking about is when you're in a point of view character and they want or need something and they encounter an obstacle or resistance to achieving what they want or need. Now, we're going to keep in mind as we go throughout this evening and throughout your work, you change the type of story you're writing, you may need to change the type of conflict. And what that means is if you're writing a children's story, you are not going to have the same kind of conflict as an action adventure novel. Okay? And sounds like a very silly thing to have to say out loud, but oftentimes we forget about that. That conflict is so important on the page. It is what keeps our stories driving forward. And we need to be aware that changing the type of story we're writing will change the type of conflict that we're going to involve our characters in. So when you have two or more committed forces in conflict, that creates tension. And that tension is what keeps the pacing, the forward movement of your story moving. It raises questions for your readers, and that's what creates a strong reason to turn the page. So if anyone has ever told you your work is they're not feeling compelled to keep reading or to turn the page, you're having an issue with conflict. One of the things that's important to remember about conflict too is that predominantly for women, but there are some men too, but women from a very early age, we are taught to play nice. We are taught that our role, our contribution to our families, to our friends, to our whatever, is to tamp down the conflict. And that's why it can be very problematic for us when we start writing, because we're all of a sudden being asked to do something that we've been told not to do for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's why when we start writing, depending on when we start writing and how we've been raised, we're also going to encounter kind of this adverse tendency if you have been raised in a family situation or dynamics or work situation where you have a lot of drama. If you've been raised from a mama or a papa who has a lot of drama and every day, then what happens is we have a tendency to learn to kind of keep the lid on it, maybe keep the lid on it. Because if there's a lot of drama in our family, if you have a sibling that act out a lot, what we learn then is this is not a good thing because it impacts everybody and it makes it hard for everybody. So it's very natural for us to not even recognize drama and to avoid drama on the page because we avoid it in life. So what we're looking for and what we're going to be talking about tonight is ways that we can remove ourselves from the equation and think about the power of conflict for our characters that allows them to really reveal themselves on the page. I want to compare two different scenarios for you, just to give you an idea of what happens when you have no conflict and when you do have conflict. All right, scenario one. Sarah, Lizzie, and Anne walk into a restaurant and they ask for a table. They're shown to one immediately. They sit down and they start talking about what to order, how nice it is to see each other, their kids, etc. No tension. There's no questions raised in the reader's mind unless you're hungry and want to know what they're going to order because you're thinking about food. But without conflict, you are forcing your reader to wait for something to happen. So let me go back that one more time. Sarah, Lizzie, and Anne walk into a restaurant and ask for a table. They're shown to one immediately. Now, right there, that's an opportunity for conflict. If they're on a tight schedule and they have to wait 45 minutes for a table, right there, small conflict. But we tend to, if we're conflict adverse, even remove that from the page. They sit down and they start talking about what to order. Ho hum, nothing's happening. Do we care? There's no questions being raised. So let's look at the same type of situation slightly different. Scenario 2, we have Sarah, who's committed to going to lunch, but right now all she wants to do is get back to her child who's running a fever earlier. Sarah isn't sure that her husband, who's taking care of the child, will know what to do if the fever gets worse, in spite of the direction she left for him. Okay, right here we have one of the characters. When we're in her point of view, we now know she has something that she's more worried about than this lunch. But she committed to the lunch, so she's going to it, but her mind is elsewhere. Her focus is elsewhere, and it raises a question for the reader. Okay, I'm hoping everybody is still here or still getting back in the classroom. I apologize. For some reason, the internet connection is dropping where I am at this time. Okay, unfortunately, I cannot see your notes at this time. Yay! All right, here we go. So, Katie, yay. Jennifer, you're back. Yes, Bettina's here. And again, I'm sorry. Last month we didn't have a problem. This month we're going to be challenged. This is what conflict is about. Okay? We deal with it in our everyday world all the time. So this is when you have conflict, what happens? Questions are raised. Do we get to keep going? Do we have to start over again? Do we have to reschedule? That's what we're looking at when we talk about conflict on the page. Too many times when we talk about conflict, we think of big conflict, and it has to last from the beginning of our story to the end. So that's not the case, and that's the opportunity for us. All stories are about change, external and internal. Now, if you are writing a literary novel, Barbara, that's for you, or anybody else that is writing a literary novel, the change is slightly different than for a commercial fiction novel. Commercial fiction novel is definitely, there's external change and there is internal change. At the end of a commercial fiction story, the reader expects to have the protagonist, the main character, learn and grow and change because of the external conflicts that they faced and overcame. In a literary novel, the character, the main protagonist, things are happening to them. And they are reacting to those things. So they are not necessarily changing over the course of the story. So the type of conflict is more things that are imposed on them, as opposed to the type of conflict created from their choices. Conflict creates change, whether that change is willingly accepted or unwilling. The end of a commercial fiction novel, because of the conflict that was faced and the character grew and changed, the outcome is, and the reader expectation is, they learn something about how to face their own challenges, their own conflict in their own worlds. In a literary novel, the conflict is basically imposed on the character so that they can understand. That's the important part that you want to keep hold of. Without conflict in your story, there's no forward movement. There's no narrative drive. And without that conflict, what happens then is you start writing commercial fiction like it is literary fiction, where you're throwing stuff at your character just so that they are in motion. But it's kind of like busy work. Busy work is not the same as actually accomplishing something. The higher the stakes in your story, the stronger the conflict can be. Depending on what your point of view character wants or needs and how badly they want or need something. If they want something and it doesn't really matter to them, you have decreased your conflict. If what they want only matters to them and no one else, it is a smaller conflict, but you can still use it. Your conflict must be true to your story. So keep that in mind. A young child wanting a new puppy is not going to encounter the same conflicts that a CIA agent tracking a terrorist cell will encounter, but they both should have conflict. So that child that wants a puppy, can you think what kind of conflict might come into play with that particular story? What could stand in the way of them getting a puppy or not getting a puppy? Go ahead and jot some notes down here just so you can see allergies. You know, Aiden, that's exactly what I was thinking. If that child has allergies, it's not necessarily, it's not an easy fix. So it is one of those things that can be impacted with 5 years worth of shots. Parents who love cats, parents' disapproval, lives in a pet building. I guess, Anna, that means a pet-free building. Sharon, an adult has a fear of dogs from childhood. Absolutely. I had a son-in-law who grew up in Mexico, and his brother was bitten by a rabid dog, and he watched his brother over 10 days die of rabies. There was nothing that was going to change his mind that not all dogs were going to be rabid. He just had that fear. Jennifer, parents say the kid isn't responsible enough. No pets allowed in the building. Cleanliness, don't want to deal with the mess. These are great answers, but you see, they're very appropriate for that type of story. I knew you guys would get this. Now, the answers that you gave for that are not what that CIA agent tracking a terrorist cell is going to encounter. This is why the pacing in these two very different types of story is going to be impacted by the size and degree of conflict. Now, some of the conflicts that you mentioned could be the big conflict over the course of the story, that even if the little ones come up and can be changed, the big one takes the whole story to be resolved. Novels need that overall conflict. When we talk about overall conflict, we're talking from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And this is often specific to the genre or the subgenre that you're writing. So, and the reason that is that genre or subgenre creates your reader's expectation regarding overall conflict. So if you are used to reading those thrillers with that CIA agent facing the terrorist threat, and you throw a conflict in of being allergic to dogs, that can play out, but it's not going to be the big conflict. Why? The word terrorist. Okay, that's the big conflict, because in those stories, the conflict is going to impact lots of people if it is not stopped in time. Giving you some examples here. The premise of a mystery is that the protagonist will right a wrong and bring justice to the larger world of the story. Now, that's whether that world of the story is a family, it's a village, it could be the society. Obstacles, which is another way to say conflict, will impede the protagonist throughout the story until this overall story goal is reached. So in a mystery, the villain, the person who committed the crime, is at odds with your protagonist. But there can be lots of other types of conflicts happening as the protagonist is trying to reach that overall conflict, which is find a person who does not want to be discovered. Premise of a romance is that a couple, in spite of internal obstacles, which are things such as doubts, their feelings, their lessons they've learned, and external obstacles, which are things such as their job or the rules of society or a family preference, disapproval, that type of thing, that those obstacles will overcome to find true love. We need those obstacles. We need it because the reader of a romance wants to know that this couple deserve each other at the end of the story, not because he's handsome and she's gorgeous, but because they are willing to risk, to take a chance, to change even for the sake of another. And that gives the readers the hope and the warm and fuzzy feeling that love is worth it, no matter what obstacles have to be overcome. So if you don't put obstacles or conflict in your story, you are leaving your reader feeling that why bother? If this guy has all the money and anything he wants, and that girl is handsome or beautiful and can have any guy that she wants, and they can get together and they both want to get together, ho-hum, end of story. The premise of a fantasy novel Okay, I am back. Must sit tight. Yay, George, you got it. Sit loose doesn't have the same ring to it. And Melissa, I disappeared just as I was talking about fantasy. It does drop, and tech guy has to run from the other room to come here and fix my part of this here. So we're compounding conflict, and we're going to class 2. So back up. Can people hear me again? If you can hear me, just let me know, and we'll keep going. We're going to be talking here about the premise of a fantasy novel and basically what a fantasy promise to the reader is. Yay! There's an overall expectation in a fantasy, and there's a lot of subgenres of fantasy, just like there's subgenres of romances or subgenres of mysteries. But what we're looking at when we're talking about fantasy is that there's a sense of otherness, and that otherness can be magical creatures or the worlds. But ultimately, there's a promise to the reader that the good will out, whether it's a good individual or the good society. Okay, just one second. We are going to do this. Depending on your subgenre in fantasy, there can be external obstacles to be overcome that can be epic in proportion. That means go big or go home. So we're talking about things such as battles and large world-altering events, or it can be smaller. It can be a creature or a bad threat, or just needing to right a previous wrong that brings the world back into balance. So each of these genres have expectations of not only what the reader wants to read it for, but also the type of opportunities for conflict. As KT points out, yes, or the ring that does not bind us. Yeah, or the computer that doesn't work. So to learn more about genre expectations, the next time you go to a movie theater or anywhere that you can see previews, watch this. That how in less than 3 minutes, stories are clearly identified as to the type of movie they are, and thus, if you love that kind of story, entice you to go and see it. And part of that is by making it clear to the viewer, to the reader, to the one who is consuming the entertainment, that what type of conflict, whether it is they have to overcome sea monsters or whether they have to overcome a different type of threat. I just went and watched the Mystical Beast movie, and that was absolutely fascinating. In those 3-minute segments that they showed, you got the protagonist, what they were up against, what type of conflict they were going to be dealing with, and what they were going to have to overcome that raised that question that made you want to go see that movie. Okay, Peggy, I'm not sure if, okay, Peggy, tech guys are replying to you, so hang on there. Something I want you to be thinking about when you think about conflict is think of it as a continuum. Instead of drawing a line across, I wanted to show you low conflict is as important as strong conflict. Okay, depending on the type of story that you're writing. All right, so now everybody's blurry, honey. Okay. Tina has a good point here. She says a good book blurb should give you the same type of information. So again, as you're writing your story, you're looking at beginning of your story. You can have the mention of a big conflict that isn't resolved to the end of the story, or you can have the protagonist is not aware that the story builds. Low-level conflict at the beginning, mid-level there at the yellowish orange thing, and then as you're getting towards the end of the book, that black moment, that climax of your story, your conflict is going to build that is appropriate for your story. Guys, tech guy is working on blurriness. I don't. Okay, he's typing the explanation out. And again, we will find a different way to do this next time so that we're not going to be dealing with this issue. But Tina points out in the J.D. Robb, aka Nora Roberts, in-depth mystery books, the main detective has little conflict. Dorman, who won't tell her about suspects, and big conflicts, trafficking, facing down a murderer, with varied levels in one book. And again, this is you're doing both as you go through this story. That big facing down trafficking or a murderer is going to be, it's in the background. That's what they're doing. As they move towards the end of the book, it gets more in your face. But you're also dealing with these low-level conflicts throughout the book. Novels also need continual conflict as smaller goals are established. So you don't go into just a book with, I got to find the killer, or I'm going to save the family farm. That's the big goal for the story. But in order to reach that big goal, they have to take lots of smaller steps, and those steps are going to be impeded by conflict. So here we go. 5 types of story conflict that you can use again and again. Now, Tech Guy, in his spare time, he's done a handout. He'll be sending that to you no later than tomorrow. So I'm going to go over the types of story conflict here. And if you have questions, be thinking about that. Also, I want to be having you think, if you had the chance to do your homework, where you, in reading a book, Do you see any of these conflicts? Do you see them in small elements or do you see them in large elements? So, first type of conflict, person-to-person conflict. Okay? Cool thing about this one is that it's the most common type of conflict we find on the page and in real life. We're always rubbing up against somebody who has their own goals, their own way of doing something. They approach things differently. They may want the job that we want. They may want something that puts them or us at odds with them. So this is what you're going to see most often. This conflict can be a small conflict, such as with a nosy sister or a neighbor. That's not life-altering, but sometimes it's that type of conflict that wears us down. And it can be used intentionally, and I'll go into that in just a second. Or there can be larger conflict between the individuals, such as the villain versus the protagonist. All right? So this is a wonderful thing to understand and know, because it can last from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, or it can be getting just like Bettina mentioned, how the detective in the J.D. Robb stories has little conflict. Doorman who won't tell her about suspects. That's a small person-to-person conflict. So keep in mind, this conflict, or any of these conflicts, can last throughout a story until the other one is vanquished, or the conflict can create character growth for your protagonist. If you've read the book A Man Called Ove, he's basically a curmudgeon. And the story is about a new family that moves to the neighborhood and starts breaking the shell around him and making him interact with neighbors that he has not interacted with for a long, long time. It's much easier to sit back and complain about everyone and see where they're all wrong than it is to care. So this is that conflict of his. It is not until the end of the book that we find out why he's become a curmudgeon. So the second type of conflict that is very common is person against nature, or against the internet. Person against nature conflict means if you've ever been lost in an unknown environment, and that environment can be Goldilocks, it can be lost in space. It could be the first time you go to IKEA and you realize, oh my God, how big this place is and how easy it is to get lost in it. Small conflict or big conflicts. Facing a threat from an environment which is normally friendly but can turn unfriendly. The stories, The Perfect Storm. Fishermen on the ocean. This is how they make their livelihood. And all of a sudden they get into the master of storms that they did not see coming. And now they have to try and survive this environment. Old Man in the Sea. It's a Hemingway story. And again, old fisherman, Portuguese fisherman, I believe, that rows out, he's fishing, and all of a sudden he's lost at sea and he has got to survive. So any of these are conflicts with nature. Conflict against nature does not need to be limited to a specific genre. That's what's really nice about it. So in your mystery novel, if your protagonist is trying to stop somebody and they're running through a crowded Christmas shopping mall, then that is, if this person is, that environment, the setting, is a conflict against nature, because that is going to hamper the person trying to catch up with somebody else, particularly if that somebody else, it's been made clear that they know this environment a lot better or they know how to get around it. Many times, but not all, the character who is struggling against nature is also struggling against themselves. And that leads to the third type of conflict. And this is the protagonist, the person who is in conflict with themselves. Person fighting against themselves can be the primary story conflict, or it can be a strong secondary story conflict. Bettina says, is it necessary that the nature conflict still be a result of the main character's choice? For example, snowstorm doesn't just happen. Character goes into snowstorm to save someone. Exactly. Or they go out ill-equipped for the weather because they think that they're smarter than their cousin who lives on the farm, but they've gone through snowstorms in New York, so they know what it's like to do it. And so they go out into a snowstorm in Montana, or a potential snowstorm. So you make it in commercial fiction, you make sure that the Okay, I'm back again. Yay, sitting tight. Yes, yes. Tech guy's telling me that we have about 15-minute increments and then it drops again. So I will speak fast and you're getting the what to do. Anna's slides aren't changing yet because I want to make sure that everybody gets back on here. We were basically talking, though, about the fact that Melissa says that in conflict with the atmosphere. Yes, I think so. So we're talking about that many times a person who is in conflict with nature is actually, it is a metaphor for something that they're dealing with, conflict with themselves. And when that is the fourth type of conflict, or maybe it's the third, I lost track. Anyway, person in conflict with themselves means that it has to do with they're fighting against themselves, what they believe, what they think they know, what they want to believe, but are blinded by previous experience, that type of thing. So it's oftentimes called man against man, which I'm sorry, that sounds like a wrestling metaphor. So when you're in conflict with yourself, for the scenario where we had the person from New York City who is on the ranch in Montana. I don't think they have farms. They have ranches. Anyway, in the ranch in Montana, you have to believe that you're right. So if that's what your belief is, so then you walk out onto the prairie or the plains there, it is your conflict with yourself that you cannot take feedback. You cannot accept help from somebody else that puts you into the external situation, the external conflict. So this man against man or person in conflict with themselves involves pitting a person against their belief system that must change in order to defeat an external obstacle or achieve a specific goal. So again, this is why when we talk about internal change, we are talking about conflict with yourself that in other situations is not causing a problem. But because we're authors and it's perfectly okay to be mean to our characters, how do we make somebody grow? How do we make them change? The same way that we do in real life. We encounter conflict and we either change the way we think or succumb to whatever the problem is, like giving up with the tech issues. So some genres are mostly about this internal conflict. So women's fiction, coming of age novels, literary novels, psychological horror or thrillers, all of these, the primary conflict is conflict against yourself, what you feel you're worth, what you expect to have happen in life, and so you're not open to other things, what you are intrinsically think the best of everyone and you run into a serial killer. That type of thing is about that internal change. Elaine says, would this be appropriate for women's fiction? Absolutely. That's why it's right up here. See that first phrase? Some genres are mostly about internal conflict, women's fiction. Yes. So that is why the external conflict in those stories is not as large or demanding because it is all about those external events are simply there in order to force your protagonist to face whatever the internal issue that has to change. So Elaine, I love you, and I know that I'm giving you a hard time here. So thank you for raising that, because sometimes I think that that it seems easy, like I've said it, Anna, it always helps me for someone to ask to make sure, even if I give them a hard time about it. Other genres use this internal conflict, this conflict against themselves, as a strong secondary plot line that can become an obstacle or challenge to reaching the goal of the primary plot. An example, if a person is a detective and their goal is to stop the killer, their conflict is their best buddy looks like they may be the killer, but this person has always watched out for the best buddy and they know the good side of the best buddy and they refuse to acknowledge that this person could be a killer. Now, in one story, it could be that they are right, and that belief is what keeps them going. But in another story, they could be putting themselves or others at risk because they were blinded by their loyalty, by their friendship, into not really seeing this person as others saw them. So the next kind of conflict, this is whatever number it is a person in conflict with society. Bettina says, lots of crime mystery shows have detectives who think they want vengeance, almost kill the murderer, but overcome that impulse and arrest murder instead, and justice prevails. Absolutely. Because that is what the reader expects. It can be life and death, but in a cozy mystery, it's not going to be that intense. So depending on the subgenre of the mystery genre, you are going to have this still sense that justice must be prevail and the protagonist has to overcome obstacles in order to make sure that happens. Jennifer says, is person versus self primarily in thrillers in general or just psychological thrillers? Great question, Jennifer. Actually, it is definitely in psychological thrillers because, again, it is all about the examination of the psyche. And this is oftentimes where you will have unreliable narratives. Just a second, coming back. Okay, Tina, I'm going to keep going here and hoping that the sound is still there. And if not, I'll just repeat everything. So in a psychological thriller, it is all about the psyche and understanding unreliable protagonist. You can have a crazy person as the protagonist, that type of situation where it's hard to tell who's good and who's bad. That is the psychological thriller, and horrors can also be that way too. But person versus self, depending on the thriller, if it is a thriller that the character protagonist is, they're going to have doubts, they're going to have concerns, they're going to have issues. So it is going to be part of the internal change that your protagonist might have to go through, but it is normally in a thriller, it is not as big as the external plot line. So in a thriller, it is oftentimes the plot line, the external stop the threat as things come to a head. So that tends to be the primary. However, if you do a thriller that is like a Harlan Coben, that is usually the guy next door type of thriller, then you are also going to find more issues about person in conflict with themselves. Because if they always believed that their family was right and that type of thing. So that's a great question. And that's where you go down into the weeds, figuring out the subgenre. So why thrillers are part of the mystery genre, there's the psychological thriller is a subgenre. The guy next door is a subgenre in the thrillers. So you can have both. And that's really a great question, why it's a good question. So when we talk about the next kind of conflict with society. Now, when we talk about society, it can be as contained as a family unit. So think Hatfields versus McCoy or Montagues versus Capulets. Those are the society, the families are in conflict with each other, which makes it very problematic if you have a character from one side of the family have to trust and believe or even fall in love with a member of the other side of the family. Another type of society is a community. Expectations in high school or a village. If you have ever been new kid on the block, you know the feeling of feeling as the outsider into an established society and trying to figure out what the rules are, who's in charge, who to stay away from, who you can trust. Or it can be a larger entity. So opposite sides of the Civil War, the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement, Anne Frank in hiding during World War II. Bettina says The Giver, Jonas versus the World and its Rules. Absolutely. Now, when you have a character in conflict with their society, the cool thing about that is that society is made up of individuals. So you often, through your novel, can show that conflict that is going to include significant elements of person against person conflict. So here's an example. If you're Jewish and you're trying to leave Germany before or during World War II, you are in conflict with the ruling order. So if you're in Germany or Germany-controlled areas, you are in conflict with the society. But you can also show that by being in conflict with a neighbor who is pro-Hitler or a soldier who owes their loyalty to the Third Reich. Why? Because they have a job now where they didn't, 3 months before, in spite of their personal beliefs. So that particular soldier might be a person who is in conflict with themselves and have to make the choice. Are they going to help the Jewish person or are they not going to help the person because they're doing it at risk to themselves? You can also show conflict with government officials who are just doing their job, just putting their head down and getting by. So this is why these 5 conflicts can intersect. and make from the small conflict to the big conflict. So when person against person conflicts include conflicts against entire systems and way in life, the overarching conflict becomes one of person against society. So if you are trying to save a world, you are against a society in many ways. So here's an example. In the novel Hunger Games, in the first novel in the series, the initial conflict is focused on Katniss Everdeen, she's the protagonist, conflict with others to survive. She is also in conflict with herself because she's been pitted against Peeta, who is someone who helped her when she desperately needed help back in their home community. But now she might have to kill him in order to survive. So you've got lots of different. We're almost there. Okie dokie. So I want to make sure that I go backwards and answer. Melissa brought up the issue about Hunger Games, that she is in conflict with the society. But that is it's in the first book, it's kind of just the way life is. So it's in the background in book 1. But because it's brought forward in book 2 and definitely in book 3. So that is how, when you're writing a series, you can take a background issue that might play out in 3 books or 5 books or 7 books down the series. It's there, it's present. It is like in Fault of Their Stars by John Green. It is about the 2 protagonists in that book are cancer survivors. They have dealt with cancer. They're dealing with treatments with cancer. But it is, in many ways, it's in the background. It just is the world that they are in. It is not a big issue that is going to cause challenges until later in the story. Tina asked, are you going to edit the video for replay? Absolutely, Tina. Tech Guy was just talking about that he will. Now, when it goes out to you tomorrow, it's going to be the normal replay. So he can't take the bits out, the breaks out, but he is going to do that. He'll clean up a copy of it, and he will send everybody a link to that copy so you can get the good copy. But Tina says there's a new movie coming out called 5 Feet about 2 teens with the disease that they can't get closer than 6 feet or they'll die. Rules of the disease, nurses keeping them apart, etc. So that is the overarching large conflict. But most of the story is going to be dealing with these small conflicts, the person-to-person conflict with the nurses, the rules of the community, the small issues that they have to deal with in order to have a normal life in an abnormal situation. So you can have the big overarching conflict that, if you're writing a series, can play out later, or is not really going to come to the fore. Think of Anne Frank's, The Diary of Anne Frank's. Now, it was not a fiction, but it showed that she accepted this is her world. We knew that the Nazis were there. We knew she was in hiding. We knew her family was Jewish, but 90% of the story is just about the people-to-people conflict, the people against self conflict, the other smaller conflicts that kept you turning the pages, knowing that there was always this kind of threat back there, but not really knowing if it was going to impose. All right, let's see if I can turn here we go. Next type of conflict is person against technology. Yay, we're there. Or the supernatural. Tech guy thinks that's really what we're dealing with today. These type of conflicts tend to be more genre specific. So, for example, in sci-fi and fantasy, including speculative fiction, you often see this supernatural, the paranormal, the sci-fi technical issues, but this does not need to be limited to those genres. So conflict against technology, which we've all been dealing with tonight, is at the core an awareness of our vulnerability against external change. So every time, they bring in the AI intelligence, bring in new systems, usually the 25 years before the change of a century and the 25 years after tends to historically be when most change happens. And that change can be learning to drive a car in 1905, or being, learning to deal with the climate change in the next 20 years. Those type of things is we bring it on ourselves, or our culture, our society brings it on. So that makes us very vulnerable, and we don't like being vulnerable, which is why we don't like change oftentimes. But stories outside of science fiction can also focus on the need to contain an external threat, such as a biological weapon or a cyber attack. Bettina says the Terminator series, we fear being wiped out by machines. Yes, machines time travel to stop the humans who will destroy them. That's absolutely that combination of sci-fi, fear technology, and time travel. So the time travel tends to be much more about that supernatural element to it. So, and when we talk about the supernatural, we're basically talking about any kind of conflict against any unknown entity. Werewolves, wizards, ghosts, as well as the gods, or any kind of inexplicable antagonist. KT points out that for Asimov, tech is most always the bad guy. Absolutely. But if you think about it, when he started writing, he was writing in the 50s. Okay, tech guy says Asimov is actually pro-tech. Anyway, the point is you have to put him in context when he survived World War II. All right? That really impacted The awareness of push of a button and everything can disappear. That it is man brought forth the atomic bomb. So this is impacted that whole initial generation of sci-fi writers. I will ask Tech Guy if Asimov was the one who said any sufficiently advanced tech is indistinguishable from magic. Nope. Tech Guy says he doesn't know who said it, but he will look it up. Oh, okay. KT says, except for him. So Tech Guy and KT were on the same plate. So when you think about supernatural, in the movie The Birds, it is about a character in conflict with this antagonist that does not expect. It's not nature, because the birds are not acting as they do in nature. They are acting counter to nature. In the Stephen King movie, the first movie of his that was on TV, and yes, you had to have TV in black and white by then because it's so long ago. Not really, but it was a movie called The Duel, and the protagonist was in conflict with a semi-truck, which seems intent on killing him. It was kind of like a prequel to current day road rage. But this truck kept coming after this man. He could never really see the person in the truck, so it was man against truck, which when you actually say it sounds really stupid, but that movie was scary. So horror oftentimes can have this, anything Stephen King often does is have it against this sense of something that you don't expect to act in the way that they normally act. Now, the point to keep in mind here is that most novels feature one of these 5 main conflicts at their core, with smaller conflicts along the way. But the good news is you can actually combine the conflicts in a story. Many of the ones that we've been talking about have small conflicts. It could be person against person, person against nature, and then you have the big overarching conflict. So look and be thinking about the movies and the books that you've been reading and paying attention to see what type of conflicts have you been playing or avoiding. So if you're having challenges with conflict, one of the things that you want to look at is your point of view character, especially if the character is your protagonist, strong enough? If you have a weak point of view character, which means you don't know your character well enough to know what are they afraid of, what is going to challenge them. One character, if they're an Arnold Schwarzenegger, they're not going to be challenged by, somebody who is physically necessarily threatening them because they have the bulk and the background and the muscle to fight them. But they might be afraid of having to be gentle or having to be something that they are not used to being. So look at, is your point of view character strong enough? Because they drive the action, and the way they drive the action is in our scenes, and the scenes drive the forward momentum of the story. So, and I know I tell you this a lot of times, but I'm going to say it again. Scenes, which include the conflict element, are the means for our reader to experience our stories. So, just like Bettina says, put that Arnold Schwarzenegger in a classroom full of kindergartens. They are out of their environment. That is person to person, person against society, person against himself, his own expectation of what he's comfortable with and what he can do. So when we're looking at conflict, if you are writing commercial fiction, your character should be, because of their choices, putting themselves into situations that are going to challenge them. If you leave a point of view character thinking or deciding or wondering for too long, and you don't start them acting, not because you threw something at them, but because they made a choice, whether it was a good choice or not. They did make a choice and they're taking an action. That gives them, they're moving the story. If you fail to give them a strong reason to act versus simply react, your story starts lagging. No conflict in your story means no narrative drive in your story. So you want to make sure that your character is acting against opposition, which is another word of saying conflict, for the strongest tension on the page, which then raises the most questions in the reader's mind and in turn drives the story. KT is mentioning Eyes Wide Shut. I did not see that story. So if there's I'm guessing that from everything I've read about that story is that it was that there wasn't, they weren't acting. They were just kind of waiting for something to happen to them. So make sure your character is acting against opposition. And it could be opposition as simple as that little girl wants a puppy and she can't have it because of something. So I'm going to show you here an example without conflict. Now that we've talked about one type of thing, let's see. Here's an example. Little girl wants to continue playing at the park after her mother calls her to come home. So the girl, but I want to stay. Mother, okay, whatever you'd like, honey. Now, not only am I going to slap this mother for saying we're going away, and the little girl says no, and the mom says, okay. That's the only conflict, is Mary coming after that mother being a wimp. All right, nothing's happening here. Now we have to wait to find out what's going to happen. Example number 2, with mild conflict. Girl, but I want to stay. Mom, no, we have to go home. Your uncle is coming to visit. Girl, just 15 minutes? Mother, okay, but we must go in 15 minutes. Now, in this example, there is a little bit of conflict because we know why. We have motivation for the mother, why she wants to get home. And you put the you've given the mom a motivation to have the girl come home. But you've also said it's not a pressing issue. You got 15 minutes, it's going to come up again. So there's a little bit of conflict, but not a lot. So here we go again. Girl, but I want to stay. Mother, knowing they'd already stayed too long. Benji would be home any minute, and if he was left alone too long, he could panic. Last time he hid himself in the tool shed, and it took hours to find him. This time he might run away. See what we did right there? We gave the mother a stronger motivation for having to get home. So she says, no, we have to leave now. Little girl, because she's a little girl, says, but Mom. And the mother says, I said now. She clapped her hands. So we added visceral body language that reinforces we're going. Okay. This is conflict from the girl's point of view, but the mother also feels this conflict because she has a reluctant child knowing that she has to get home for another child. So again, it's not bombs. It is not big conflict. It is little conflict, but it raises questions in the reader's mind. So that leads us to the second reason that conflict can be missing on the page, is there's no sense that something must happen now, or at least sooner rather than later. Example 1 we just read, no conflict because nothing had to happen. They got to stay there at the park. So it was just words on the page and was taking up space waiting for something else to happen. The second example, you had a sense that something was going to happen sooner rather than later within 15 minutes. Then it was going to be a showdown between mom and little girl. But in the last example, it had the most conflict and the most tension because we knew that what had to happen now. Urgency creates conflict based on the pressure of time. Repeat after me. Urgency creates conflict on the page based on the pressure of time. If your character can postpone their action, the longer that postponement happens, the more you water down your conflict. Sometimes you want to water down that conflict, sometimes you don't. And yes, Bettina knows this is called a ticking clock. If you add a sense of urgency for your character, you'll add a sense of urgency for your reader. Now, where you want to see this is at those big plot points in your story, that they have to make a decision and take an action, even knowing that the action can have consequences they're not looking forward to. But without that, you have no reason to keep turning the pages there about a quarter of the way into your story, halfway through your story, and at your climax or black moment. If your conflict is more an inconvenience than true conflict, and the rule of thumb here is if you can take your characters and take them out of the story, just 15 minutes, you are the god and goddesses of your story. You can do this. Lift them out, put them down at Starbucks or whatever Panera coffee shop close. Could they talk through the issue and it would go away? If that's the case, it's not really true conflict. Now, in some genres, though, they could never do that. So if you're writing a Regency romance, Jane Austen novel, if you are writing any type of situation that character in that environment would really not be able to talk to the person because of the external context, then you can have a misunderstanding being conflict. So it might look like an inconvenience, but in that environment, it is a true conflict. So individually, a conflict that lacks a sense of stopping power is going to flatline your conflict. And what that means is this. Your character's hiking up a hill. They become tired. Okay. So a little later, they get hungry. They keep going. And after more hiking, they grow thirsty. These are inconveniences. These are not conflict. So what you do as a writer is you look at how would you combine these. So individually, if they are tired, but they kept going, if they're hungry and they kept going, if they're thirsty and they kept going, they are just inconveniences that happen with hiking. But if you put them in combination, if all of a sudden they are so tired they can't go any further, if they're so starved they're ready to eat the grass, or if they're so thirsty their tongue is hanging out, this creates a stronger reason to stop or give up. So it creates a stronger sense of conflict. Now, you can bundle minor inconveniences to make a stronger conflict, or you just add a bigger conflict. So on that hike, you have a rock slide. Very definitely a bigger conflict if they have to get through or around that rock slide. Wild animal on the prowl, darkness falling with a broken flashlight. All of these things raise a stronger question in the reader's mind than a single inconvenience. Your conflict remains the same. Okay, repeating a situation intentionally by using the power of 3 is one thing, like this. Your character, who is conflict averse, faces an angry man in chapter 2 and walks away. They face the same man in chapter 17, and they start to talk back until they become overwhelmed and cowed. But in chapter 27, they face that same angry man or an angry situation and are able to face him head on, tell him where to stuff it, and then proceed toward the goal. That's bam, bam, bam. You're using the power of 3. The 3-point sequence creates this intentional echo where on the third beat or third time the situation's encountered, with the reader expecting the character to cave, because you've raised that as a question. They've caved twice. Are they going to be able to stand up for themselves now? If on that third time they grow a spine, that shows a surprise for the reader and a character growth. Now, If you ignore the power of 3 and just keep repeating the same conflict with no change, Chapter 2, your character faces an angry man. Chapter 5, the same character faces the same angry man. Chapter 9, 12, 17, 22, same conflict occurs. Nothing changes. There are no questions raised for the reader. Don't waste page space on it. Okay, and we've seen this. We can see this oftentimes in novels, particularly I've noticed it a lot in young adult novels, where the author never anticipated writing a series. They wrote a story or 1 or 2 story in the world of, and all of a sudden now they have to make a 5 or 7 book arc out of this. And so they have the same bloody conflict over and over. Am I going to choose him or am I going to choose the other one? Do I like the werewolf or do I like the vampire? Do I like the vampire? Well, I didn't like him last time, so I'm going to like the werewolf, that type of thing. The only thing that happens when you do this kind of scenario, when you've ignored the power of 3 and made it ad nauseum, is you've made it easier for your reader to put your book down. So, how to tell if your story has conflict or not. If your critique partner tells you it feels as if nothing is happening, or if you get a rejection letter from an editor or agent that says they're just not compelled to keep reading, conflict is missing. If you look at your story and see over and over again that stuff is happening to your character because you need them to act, conflict is missing. Conflict in your story should happen because of the choices your character makes and the actions they decide to take, unless you are writing a literary novel. In a literary novel, things happen to your character. That's why it's called episodic writing, and that is in order for them to understand a point, it keeps happening to them in a different way. That's not what's occurring in a commercial fiction novel. If your character's walking down the street to the grocery store and a dragon flies overhead, that is episodic. It just, boy, it's been 20 pages, nothing's happened, I'm going to throw a dragon in here. Now, that conflict is imposed on them out of the blue. And that is because the author feels the story is lagging and throws something at them. Unless that character knows that there have been sighting of dragons. So now the character's decision to act, walk to the store, puts them in conflict with the prowling dragons. You've raised a question the minute the character becomes aware that there might be a problem if they take an action. But if they don't take an action, they have no food at home, and so now they have a choice. What are they going to do? And each of these things raises questions in the reader's mind. One of the things to help you identify conflict-averse writing is to set your story aside for days or weeks, as much time as you can give yourself, then read your words fresh. If you become bored, you're probably missing conflict. If you can find a beta reader, and a beta reader who is a reader more than a writer is wonderful, because writers have a tendency to want to impose their own solutions to the problem. But all you need to know from your beta reader is notify you. Have them make a note when their attention wanders or they lose interest. That's going to tell you conflict is not there. If they make a note where they feel the story lags, where things slow down. Another way to do this is to give it to someone in your family who you can read it out loud to them, but it would be better if they read it to you because they don't know the inflection that you want there. But if you hear it from them and you start getting bored, there's a conflict issue. Always keep in mind that conflict on the page is your friend, because conflict keeps your readers engaged. And particularly when we've been raised to be conflict adverse in real life, that can be problematic. So identifying what to do, what ways you can add conflict means that your character comes alive on the page. They're not just walking across the stage. They are walking across the stage knowing that they have to see their ex on the other side and they still have a flame for them. That little hint of conflict, or big, depending on the situation, is what raises the question and keeps that reader turning the page to find out what's going to happen. Conflict should be doled throughout the story in small doses, as well as being used in larger doses. Make sure your conflict is appropriate to what you are writing, to your genre, and to where the reader is in the story. Again, you go from smaller conflict, building up so that you have greater conflict in the midpoint of the story than you had at that first quarter of the story. You have your greatest conflict at that climax of the story, a do or die moment. Are they going to really get that puppy dog, or are they not going to get that puppy dog? Will they run away from home to get a puppy dog because they found a puppy that was lost and they've been protecting it, or will their family find them and be able to find a reason to keep the dog? So it grows. Don't start that, because if you start your conflict too high at the beginning of your story, it makes it really hard. Where is the story going to go when you're building towards it? As your protagonist draws closer to those bigger story goals that you have, finding the killer, admitting love or acknowledging it, the conflict should increase, not decrease. If you've been raised to avoid conflict, use a different word. Challenge. What challenges are your character facing? What obstacles? What struggles? What clash? What contention? Use a word that works for you, because if you don't, you will keep avoiding what you think is something you shouldn't be doing. Conflict is a craft element that can be learned. And this is important to keep in mind, even for the conflict-averse writer. Bettina says, child goes into danger to get dog. Dog saves child from danger. Reluctant parent lets kid keep dog. Do you see? As writers, we automatically, once we start setting conflict up in our stories, we've got to find out what's going to happen. We have to finish that story. We have to write that story. And that, even from the very small little what could happen scenario, creates the possibility. A story without conflict is a dead story. It flatlines. It just lays there. No matter how many things you throw at your character, it's just going to be. And then they walked here and something happened to them, and they walked there and something happened to them, and they walked here and something more happened to them. That is fine if you're writing literary fiction, because the point of the story is to understand the issue under discussion, not to solve the issue, not to fix the problem, not to change the character. It is simply to look at an issue from different directions. Ignoring conflict on the page is a risk you don't want to take as a writer. So every one of you who not only came tonight, but also kept checking back in, you are ahead of those other writers who are simply writing nice scenes and fantasies of their own, or just want to play nice on the page because they've been taught to be nice in real life. Now, I wanted to read some questions that were sent to me and share them with you. It's going to take, I know we're a little bit over, but I'll read fast. Barbara asked, could you say a few words about conflict in a literary novel? Is it the same? No. Is it different? Yes. How? because the conflict is, again, imposed upon your protagonist. It is what they have to experience in order to understand the issue that they are dealing with. If you're writing commercial fiction, that character is making the choices that are putting them into a situation of facing a person or facing an environment or facing a society or facing the rules. It is their choice that is doing this, and as a result, they're going to grow and change. So that's the big difference. Great question, Barbara. Really appreciated that. I also wanted to share this really good note that I have, and I'm not going to use the writer's name. She'll know who she is, and she brought another writer with her to class tonight, which is freaking brilliant, and this is why. And hello, Jenna, I hope you're still here. Because this is, and for those who are conflict averse, you may find yourself in this. I came down with bronchitis a few weeks ago. I hope you're feeling better, by the way. Couldn't move much without coughing. All I could do was read, so I decided to read about conflict. Note to self, this does not make you feel a lot better when you have conflict going along with bronchitis. But I went to my shelf of writing books and made a pile of the books I thought would be helpful. Goal, conflict, and motivation, conflict, action, and suspense, The Plot Whisperer, Emotional Craft of Fiction. I devoured How Not to Write a Novel. She said, I read over the notes from Break into Fiction, which we hammer in conflict as we go through that. Jack Bickham's Scene and Seat Structure, which is about conflict in each and every scene. She went on, I had coffee with friends and quizzed them about the view of conflict in fiction. I irritated other family members by making comments like, that was conflict. I'm sure that was conflict, as we watched movies. You see right there, that created conflict. When the writer in you is always figuring out the end of the story, or somebody needs to know something about and they ask you about it, so you're taking away, you're answering the question before the story actually answers the question. So you were creating conflict even in asking about it. I called up my brother and asked him about our shared childhood, asked him why we both ended up conflict adverse. I sat in a coffee shop and reviewed my life, trying to remember moments when I'd fled from conflict and moments when I had stood strong and fought. I discussed conflicts with psychologists, engineers, writers, and my dog. I collected many opinions and got my nose licked, luckily by my dog. But I learned many things about my foray into this topic. And again, you know who you are. You get extra gold stars for going this deep. First, she now says the word conflict without stuttering. Second, she can write a scene or plot a story without immediately attempting to protect her characters. Third, she can recognize the role of conflict in movies that she watches and in books that she reads. But now she's wondering, how does this apply to life? And this is the important part, particularly for the women in the class. She says, I've learned it's hard for me not to take care of everyone, to protect them from conflict. I've been the nurturer for many years. It was a role I took on as a child. It's a role that I value and do not want to give up. And here's the good answer. You don't have to give it up in real life. But she's learning to let fictional characters make their way into danger. I'm wondering if other real characters in my life need that same freedom. I'm now thinking of conflict as a crucible, using this definition of the word crucible, a situation of severe trial, or in which different elements interact, leading to the creation of something new. This is, and I'm ad-libbing here, this is why the greatest generation is called the greatest generation. It wasn't because war was imposed on them. It was because they answered the call to war. They left their families for years at a time. They went into danger. They changed themselves. They changed the world. They went into conflict, both external and internal. She says, if we always choose safety and comfort, then we never enter the crucible, the place that tests us. Who wants to read a novel about safety and comfort? it would be boring. It is equally boring to live a life of only safety and comfort. I'm finally beginning to accept that there's a role for conflict in life and a price to pay if you avoid conflict. I wanted to share that with the class because to me, she really, really, instead of realizing, because we actually worked together over a number of books, and each time it was like, do you realize there's no conflict in this story? And she would come back and little, but then it would die out really kind of quick. And I think it was third book that we talked about, and it was like, yes, you got it. You got conflict, but it didn't feel comfortable. So what she did in real life is faced that this was a challenge for her, but it didn't mean she had to stay stuck there. That she could learn about the power of conflict on the page and what it does makes a difference in the craft. And I wanted to share that with you because it is so empowering and so important. And I'm absolutely touched that she not only took this journey toward conflict and understanding, but also understood that it didn't have to be an either-or situation. That if she had conflict on the page did not mean that her life had to be filled with conflict in order to get it there. So I want to thank you for that, and for everyone who sent me their homework and asked questions about conflict. We're going to be coming to a close here simply because I know that the technology is going to die on us here again in about 2 minutes. But I want to thank you, and feel free. If you have a question about conflict, please let me know. Send me the question. You will get the handout about the 6 types of conflict, the 5 we discussed, and the 6th one is basically combining any of those other 5. Rhonda says that great information. The comment about deepening a secondary conflict issue throughout a series just opened a door to a series I've been working on. Yay! An issue I hadn't even considered carrying over could be huge for the men in the series if I did expand on it. Thank you. I am so glad because, again, either we take for granted that conflict is going to be happening simply because we're writing the story and throwing stuff at our characters. But when you dig down into the weeds and find out how powerful it can be, it can open doors. And you will get the replay. You're going to get it. Tech Guy will make it so it's not quite so long. And just really glad that you've been here. KT says, I'm conflicted. Do I say great webinar? Do I say wonderful webinar? Both. That's Tech Guy's words. Now, want to let you know that if you want to know more about conflict, one of the things next month we're going to be talking about is belief systems of characters. And one of the powers of that is to understand that self against self conflict. So that's next month's webinar that's coming on January 16th. The following week, we will also have a motivational webinar if you have signed up for the 6-month program or the mastery class. So you get 2 webinars next month, and we're going to have them someplace where we can actually keep the webinar going. I also want to let you know that I'm going to send out tomorrow, got my act together here, talk about conflict, but mapped out all next year's webinars that are coming out. So we'll be sending those out. Sharing, yes, the handout for this webinar you're just in is going to be sent out no later than tomorrow, and it is going to be a graphic with those 5 types of conflict to use in your story so you can pin it up on the wall or bulletin board near your computer so that you can be thinking, oh, here's the kind of conflict that might work well here. So you'll get that handout, and you'll also get a list of upcoming classes for 2019. So I appreciate your being here and hanging in there with us and learning. Conflict is all around us all the time. So in real life, it's okay to minimize it. So it but we never really live in a conflict-free world, and don't let your characters live in conflict. So I'm glad that you were here. Peggy, I'll see you in January. And Aiden, I really appreciate your comments. And Melissa, yay, you're getting conflict. As Bettina says, the worst days make the best stories. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're not taking notes in the operating room, then you're not a real writer, even if you're the one being operated on. So thank you all for being here, and I will see most of you, I hope, next month with a way to make sure that this stays up and live. So replay coming out soon. Hope you enjoy your holidays and enjoy your writing. Don't forget to write. That's a conflict. Having holidays and trying to find time for write, that's a conflict, but it doesn't mean that only one is going to win. So have fun when you do get to write, and I will be talking to you soon. So take care. Great job.